Everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. We're back. I hope you had a nice lunch or dinner between our sessions, the afternoon session and this session, the last one for the day for us. Good afternoon to everybody. I see Vasilios, he's consistent saying good evening or good morning, and Kalispera και από τη Βοστόνη. Good afternoon from Boston itself. It's a distinct pleasure for me to chair this panel, this presentation, for a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's a very interesting topic and a very interesting panel on what's going on in not only in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the whole idea of cybersecurity and cybersecurity and the United States in 2022. But it's a double pleasure because the presenter is a former student and an alum and somebody that has consistently not forgotten her roots and where she has come from at Emmanuel, and she's achieved great distinction. And I'm very, very grateful that she has accepted our invitation once again. Here at the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, and in collaboration with the Karamanlis Chair at the Fletcher School, the International Relations Institute of Pantheon University, and the National Public Administration International Relations University of Romania are, for the second time, we have putting together this Georgi Danis seminar on security and diplomacy in the region. And as we have seen in the last 4 sessions, we have really addressed the wicked challenges in the region, and one that's really becoming a preeminent one despite the issues of energy and climate that we have been looking at, but one that's really something that's really becoming a major issue is this issue of cybersecurity. And in some ways, even within the NATO charter, cybersecurity or cyber attack could be an Article 5 kind of a issue. So you can see how imperative this has become. So we have with us Lauren Protentis, who is a national security and communications expert, having worked at the US State Department, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and now the Department of Homeland Security. She focuses on disinformation, counterterrorism, and communications. Lauren's also a non-resident fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. So I would say really you're in for a treat this Friday afternoon. Lauren, the floor is yours, and a hearty welcome to this seminar. This is your home.
Great. Thank you so much, Petros, and really good to be here today. I not only enjoy doing this because I'm somewhat obsessed with the topic of sort of information influence and cybersecurity, but also because I have Spartan Greek heritage. So the Eastern Mediterranean is I'm very fond of the region, and really happy to be with such a broad array of students today. So I'm going to talk about, let's just see if I can get my screen here to work. I'm going to talk about a whole slew of different things that I think everybody that works in sort of national security thinks that the thing that they focus on is the most important issue of the day. I really wholeheartedly believe that the topic of sort of disinformation and information operations and cybersecurity is probably one of the biggest global challenges we're facing at the moment. And, I worry, I worry that most nations aren't equipped to sort of address the threat that this poses. It adds a different element to sort of traditional geopolitical issues, in that it's not just about military force or policy options, but there's a huge array of a major array of tools that are available to state actors and non-state actors at this moment that doesn't involve much money, it doesn't involve much planning, it doesn't involve following traditional international norms, if you will. And so it's a major space of vulnerability for the global community. And so I'm just gonna, I'm really happy to talk with you about this, and we'll walk you through a whole bunch of things. I'll try to keep it to about 30 minutes of time. and leave some room for questions here. So I'll talk about sort of how policymakers think about this problem. We'll do a few case studies. I'll give you some history of how I think of the problem, some future considerations for 2022. And then I really want to hear from the group here how you know, after I've gone through this lecture, what you think in your own environments, in your own regions might be subject to the threat of disinformation. I think that many folks thought that the term infodemic was an exaggeration of where we were in the communications environment. But I think, a year ago, especially for folks in the US, we saw the, insurrection on January 6th as a critical moment in sort of the capability that information can bring to a domestic conflict. So I think the term infodemic is no longer considered by academics or practitioners to be an aberration from the truth, but very much represents where we are. And so I like to define this as a sort of communications virality that's difficult to contain or source, in which truthful or semi-truthful and false information is difficult to distinguish and comes from both well-intentioned and nefarious sources on many different platforms. So this is how I like to think about this problem currently. It sort of is something you'll hear throughout the media and different academic circles to describe where they think we are right now on this problem. I want to review some broad concepts with you to get you familiar with the vernacular of how we speak about this problem. So I'll talk about strategic activities from state actors, which is we describe as malign influence. Information operations, which is a very defense-related term, but really captures, I think, the whole slew of tools that we describe, and those include disinformation, misinformation, and then I'll talk a bit about influence operations. Cybersecurity, and then we'll describe and discuss some of the tactics that we are seeing play out every day, every minute, every second of the day at this given time. Before I get into this, I totally forgot to say I am here as an individual. My views that I'm sort of sharing here today don't represent that of the U.S. government. They're my own personal views. So I just wanted to make sure that you all know that this isn't reflective of sort of the position of the U.S. government, but my own thoughts and opinions here. Okay, that said, who are the actors that we often think of when we're talking about this problem, especially when we're convening as in global communities and international forums, and from the purview of the U.S. government. We think of Russia, China, and Iran being the major players in this problem, as well as the increased prevalence in non-state actors, QAnon, far right and far left extremist groups, and that's pervasive across Europe, primarily Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the United States. Of course, that exists just about everywhere, but we really see that playing into this whole ecosystem very prominently in Europe and the US, and then of course politically motivated groups. So what do I mean when I say malign influence? These next few slides are going to be kind of like a mouthful, so feel free to read along here or just listen as I speak. But malign influence is a term that has been particularly prominent in the past couple, I'd say like the past decade, but more prominently in the past couple of years. And that's because like all of a sudden, policy maneuvers that were traditional between state and state went on to include cybersecurity or cyber risks, information manipulation risks, and malign influence sort of represents all the tools that are now available to a state that include both traditional nefarious things as well as the tools that are available in the information environment. So malign influence is influence operations, which I'll describe in a moment, plus the use of cultural, economic, political, and cyber maneuvering, those that are both obvious and not entirely obvious for a specific actor to achieve their geopolitical goals. the actors that use malign influence often exploit an economic, political, or cultural vulnerability to exert influence and gain, again, that geopolitical advantage. So countries that are particularly vulnerable to malign influence is really everyone, but especially those that have an economic, cultural, political vulnerability. This can be I have a few just sort of chapeaus for you here. One of the things that we see prevalently in Africa right now is huge investment from China, the building of cell phone towers, the building of ports, the offering of loans to countries that are severely economically disadvantaged. By making these maneuvers in Africa, the development of cell phone towers might on the surface look like, oh, it's, accessibility to modern communications for Africans. But below the surface, it means that, China now, manages the entire, information infrastructure in a given country or region. One of the things that we saw, particularly after COVID, was China really going on this offensive sort of campaign to sort of reprieve its previously, bad image in terms of how they contributed to the spread of COVID-19. And so they were offering PPE and, ventilators and vaccines, to nations that were struggling in a really strategic way. And so, maneuvers like that can be seen as malign influence. I won't get into China and the Indo-Pacific, but I would research that if you want to know more about malign influence in that region. But this is really present in many parts of the world, and a term that we often refer to. Information operations, as I previously described, it's sort of everything separate from like sort of policy options, I'd say. So the use of complex and an integrated array of capabilities to influence, disrupt, or usurp the decision-making of an adversary or a people that, again, influence geopolitical outcomes. The target or aim here is often, domestic groups. It's to sort of undermine the policy options of a state to act, to denigrate, a state and manipulate them, so to speak, to not be able to do the policy option, for instance, that they had on the table. The French elections, which we'll talk about in 2017 in a minute, and the 2016 US elections are really good case studies on how information operations can, one, be successful and then on the other hand, not be successful. We consider the, hacking of the Democratic National Committee's email system, and subsequent disinformation and leaking of emails to be a really successful and well-planned information operation led by Russia against the United States, that arguably had an impact on the outcome of that election. So just, wanted to cover that here. And then disinformation, is the deliberate creation or sharing of false information with the intent to deceive or mislead audiences. An example here that I wanted to provide is one that is just a common example is in the 2016 US elections. There was this headline here that Pope Francis had endorsed President Trump for president of the United States. This was shared on a website called WTOE News, and it was shared. It was the single most popular social media share on Facebook in that year. It had in a period of time, I guess. So it was the most shared in the shortest period of time, and it was shared almost 1 million times on Facebook, leaving many people confused about the veracity of this statement or not. And this is disinformation, and the purveyors of this information were intending to deceive the folks that were receiving this post on Facebook. Misinformation is the unintentional sharing of false information. One word on mis and disinformation and anything sort of related to this field, this really thrives in environments with open and permissive social and traditional media environments with strong free speech protections and sort of low regulation of social media companies. In states where the government, more authoritarian governments, have a stronghold on power, information flows from the top down, and there's not as much there isn't as much freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, so it's less likely to occur in states like that. The image here on the right is an example of misinformation, probably one of, in my opinion, one of the most potentially traumatic. Well, maybe not, there's so many, but like one of the things I think too that's a good example. Some of you may be familiar with how a sort of military outfit in Hawaii shared that there was an incoming ballistic missile headed towards Hawaii, and that folks needed to take immediate shelter. I mean, this message was flashed on highways, on like jumbotrons, across traditional media, social media. It had people absolutely in a panic that there was an inbound ballistic missile heading for Hawaii. The intent of there was no malintent in sharing this message. It was just a mistake. So this is an example of misinformation, and a really traumatic one at that. And so whether it's dis or misinformation, they can both be equally as harmful. The difference between the two is intent, intent to harm or not, or non-intent to harm. And so that's an important distinction if you're thinking about what the difference is between the two. Moving on to cybersecurity, this is it's a tool in the toolbox, right? But it sort of exists in a different space than information operations in terms of how we think of the problem, and I'll tell you that. I'll talk more about that in a second. So it's the art of protecting networks, devices, and data from unauthorized access to criminal use, and also the protection and integrity of information on any given server or network. The intent of like cyber actors isn't always grandiose. It can be just folks that are curious, that want to sort of demonstrate that they can breach a system. There can be petty criminal use. You hear a lot about ransomware now, which is actually not petty criminal use, and it's really it's very impactful in that like a cyber actor can hold the information on a network ransom until the owner of that information pays a ransom. We had that actually happen here in Washington, D.C., where the Metropolitan Police Department, their server was hacked, and all of the information of undercover police officers was being held by a ransomware actor. And so the Metropolitan Police Department only paid like a portion of the ransom. By the way, you should never pay the ransom. That's just if this ever happens to you. And so all of that private information and that sensitive information was released to the public by this actor. So that's like a big, obviously nefarious intent. A cyber attack is an intentional attack by a malicious actor to gain access to an unauthorized system or a protected system. One of the areas where we see a combination of disinformation and cyber is with this tactic called hacking and leaking. It's where an actor gains access to a system, steals the information, and then leaks it to the public. And this is something that the U.S. saw in the U.S. 2016 general elections, and something that the other governments have faced in a number of different ways. So the important difference between cyber attacks or cybersecurity violations and information operations is, I'm happy to actually ask the group here if if you can kind of identify what the main distinction is between a cyber intrusion attack or hack and a disinformation campaign. since I know you all are, thinking about the answer, I'll just go ahead and give you the spoiler here.
Yeah, you can raise your hands if you want to participate with it, because I've been, you have to give the so once if somebody wants to raise their hand, I'll be more than happy to include you in. So the silence is partly technical more than anything.
Okay, I'll stand by for another minute.
I don't see any hands popping up, so I'd go ahead.
Okay, great. So the main difference between the two is really what the target of the adversary is. Misinformation, disinformation, and information operations, and to a lesser extent, malign influence. They're targeting your cognition, right? Your ability to be able to decipher fact from fiction, to know, to distinguish truth from, falsehoods, and to diminish over time your trust in sort of institutions and media and so on and so forth. So the target is really your cognition, your ability to decide and decipher between fact and fiction. Cyber attacks and intrusions, on the other hand, target a system and sensitive information. So it's important to know these two things because separately they have equally, bad outcomes, but combined they have even worse. So, and sort of, the actors that I mentioned at the beginning know that. And so this is just an important distinction to make, and know that these two things can be combined, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So I want to just talk about the French elections here. If you haven't read about the 2017 French elections, it's a fascinating sort of case study. So I'll just go through it quickly here. So in 2017, remember, this comes off of the heels of the 2016 US elections, where there was, a really major information operations campaign aimed at the United States. Here we had Macron, a pro-European, liberal, I think moderately liberal candidate. Vice Le Pen in the runoffs, who was a nationalist and who is a nationalist and sort of far-right candidate that's very anti-Europe and to some degree, pro-Russia. These two candidates are actually, competing against each other with a whole bunch of others in the 2022 French elections. This also, aside from it being after the US presidential, Brexit was taking place, or was in formation, and taking place in the UK. There was, lots of, talk about sort of, the rise of Russia and their, and sort of this this sort of war of ideas as to, should countries turn east, should they turn west? And that's also a topic that's still, ongoing. I won't talk about the goals right now, but I will talk about the information operation. So there was a disinformation campaign led by Russia and associated Russian actors, where they, first, about 6 months in the lead up to this election, began a pretty robust disinformation campaign that was sort of denigrating Macron and propping up Le Pen. It included a whole bunch of sort of, the creation of social media sites and state media, Russian state media sort of, involvement. There was a hack that targeted the computers of about 5 campaign staff of Macron. Macron's email was actually never hacked. And there was the leaking of stolen data and 22,000 emails just 2 days before the second and final round of elections. Now, one of the things that complicates this operation here is that France, unlike the US, for instance, and probably many other states, has a 48-hour media blackout, where the media, after polls close, I believe, or before polls close, candidates are prohibited from from continuing their campaign. The media is blacked out, so they can't talk about the campaign. And the intent of this is to avoid misinformation or disinformation from impacting the elections just moments before they happen. And so, but in that void, and these documents were leaked 2 days before. The timing was very strategic, 2 days before the elections. And so now it created a great space for the social media environment to step in and really to dictate what was said in these emails, what was going on. And so a lot of folks turned to social media to get answers because the media and sort of campaign staff couldn't talk about this at the moment. But in the end, and I'll go through some of the tactics in a minute, Macron still won the election. The information operation by and large failed to get Le Pen elected and to denigrate Macron. And there's a number of reasons why. Firstly, after sort of watching what happened in the US 2016 general elections, France started taking some really significant steps to protect themselves. And they clearly were still the subject of a hack, but they had prepared the French electorate for the fact that this might happen in the lead up to the election. So, French citizens knew what to look out for. They, solidified their systems to the best of their ability, and a few other things, which I'll talk about in a second. Some of the tools and tactics that had been used, which are broadly used in all sorts of campaigns, is the use of state-sponsored media and propaganda. So Russia Today and Sputnik, Russian state media, sort of and affiliated media sites, sort of laid the groundwork months before and even days before this hack took place, sort of insinuating that there was, not only did they, was there interesting and curious information from hacked correspondence from Hillary Clinton back in 2016. They also said that, Julian Assange, who's the head of sort of a big or known to leak information, had documents that he was prepared to release to the public. They painted, Macron as a U.S. agent, backed by a very wealthy gay lobby, that he was a puppet of Jewish financiers and Muslim terrorists. And so these were sort of narratives that were being promulgated across media for quite some time in the lead up to the election. They used social media accounts and inauthentic accounts and bots. So inauthentic accounts versus regular accounts are that the person behind the account isn't who they say that they are. They could be a bot, or they could be, a Russian, Iranian, or Chinese, actor sitting behind a Facebook name and image that's like John Smith from like Wichita, Kansas. So that's what makes them inauthentic. Russian groups and even non-Russian groups, when these sorts of narratives began to take hold, there were inauthentic accounts, a whole bunch of inundation of sort of comments about Macron along these narratives on news websites, and there was a lot of support from even far-right groups in the U.S. And international sort of alt-right groups, along with sort of pro-Russian groups, all sort of forming these like really nefarious online chat rooms to sort of promote the narratives that Russia had initially planted. And then a hashtag became very popular in the lead up to the election called Macron leaks, where once the documents were leaked to the public, they were shared over 500,000 times, missing a zero there, in 24 hours. Also websites and proxy websites. So these are proxy websites or websites that look like real websites, or look like an authentic news source. But sort of the real identity of the folks that run the website is being hid. So they used proxy websites to both release information and to drive sort of visitorship and readership on the sort of hack, the Macron leaks incident. But aside from just that, I thought it was important to mention that proxy websites are being used in every sort of facet of this problem. You can see here that Russia in the US had used in the lead up to the 2020 elections websites called Newsstand 7, usjournal.net, Russia has used Newsfront or Global Research or the Cultural Heritage Foundation, all of which appear to be like innocuous, sort of Western focused or news media sites. And in fact, they were being run by Iran and Russia. And then there's, of course, the role that unwitting and sort of witting amplifiers played in the 2017 French elections. Russia did a really good job of sort of preparing the information environment for what was going to happen surrounding those elections, and sort of leveraged other groups that aren't necessarily thought of as closely tied to things in France, but far right groups globally became amplifiers of the content that Russia was putting out, and even generally, global citizens at some point don't know whether they're reading real or fake information. And so a lot of the false narratives around Macron were being promoted by unknowing global citizens. Wanted to talk a bit about deep fake and manipulated videos and text. This is like an increasing problem, like everything I've said, but the sort of manipulation of documents, the manipulation of video and text that sort of capture real things happening, but that are manipulated to say something else is a real concern. On the one hand, and the other hand, there's deep fake technology where a video can be completely like a human being policymaker can be completely manipulated to say things in a video using artificial intelligence. And we consider those to be really tremendous threats in the future. There were some deep fakes with President Obama and Boris Johnson and even Mark Zuckerberg that sort of had a really, that had far reach within a short period of time, leaving people wondering, whether, what Obama was saying was real, what Zuckerberg was saying was real. And so you can imagine in a really tumultuous sort of, policy environment, those things can really have an impact on policy. This one image to the right here was actually a forged document by Russian affiliated actors against US Embassy Moscow, where they alleged that US Embassy Moscow had written a letter in support of a Russian activist whom they wanted to destabilize Russia. So this is not a real document, but it's a fake document that was manipulated to create reputational issues for the United States. It was released by a Russian website, and it sort of captures the narrative that they wanted, which is to say that like the U.S. was meddling in sort of domestic Russian politics. But what the U.S. Embassy Moscow did, which is a really smart thing to do, is they mocked up the actual document here and sort of poked fun at how clearly this wasn't written by the United States. And why is that? Because they made like some very basic flaws, like, they included a Gmail account instead of an official State Department email address. They spelled consular wrong. The spacing was off. All sorts of things that, really undermined the attempt of this sort of tactic to sort of say that the U.S. to sort of make it look authentic. So just something I wanted to share here with you. It's an interesting take on how to respond to disinformation. I realize I'm going pretty long here, so I'm going to go through these next slides pretty quickly. With all of what I've just said, I thought it would be helpful to give you a little bit of background on how we got where we. Go ahead.
Take your time. We have time. So if you have the time, it's really an informative conversation. I think you're providing us a. So it's up to you.
Okay, good. I know I can tend to go long here. So, so anyhow, the history of information and influence. This is how I like to think of some key milestones and sort of the acceleration of the spread of information, broadly speaking. The biggest change, especially in the 2000s, we're 20 years past 2000 now, 22 years past 2000. So this isn't a recent thing, but was the change from sort of one source of information or the fact that we used to just have like, one source of information that reached many people, right? One or a few. There was a few news stations, there was a few, there was like minimal newspapers, like there was just like the sort of the sort of information machine was really slow. And so the vector for sort of interfering and influence was very low. You had the Gutenberg press and in the late 1400s, this the onset of radio and TV, which again is really one-to-many communications. Then of course the internet changed everything. Not only did it, and I sound like an old fogey here, but like, this is an important point. Not only did it change the way that we communicated, where really, and social media, where like anybody can be seen now as a credible source of information. Anybody can put a false narrative out there, and it reached hundreds of thousands of folks. You have, ordinary citizens, as well as state actors, as well as, just, folks intended to, that are intent on manipulating, use social media to sort of influence. And so now what we have here is many types of communications that reach many types of people, and peers are being seen as authorities on, or peers are being seen as authorities on a variety of different issues to which they have very little expertise. Another thing about that makes cyber really important between the 1900s and where we are now is this concept of the Internet of Things. A planned cyber attack in the late 1900s, the late 1990s, couldn't have had, it could have impact, right? Like, but we were just beginning to come online and realize that, like, computers can make our life easier. Now, everything that we do is connected to a system. Our vehicles, our, televisions, our iPhones, our watches, our earphones. I mean, there's just so many vectors for attack, as we say. So the Internet of Things not only made, is really the key point that makes cyber so such a likely tool of an adversary at this moment, because it's just everything is connected to the internet. I mean, there's I think you've probably heard that, in the past, folks, have had their like in-house Alexa systems or Google systems hacked by somebody. It's just very, very easy now, because everything is connected, and we refer to that as the Internet of Things, to impart a sort of cyber consequence. Let's see. So here's how I like to think of like the sort of the modern era, and how we got to where we sort of are in this very moment in the later 2010s. So I mean, the Arab Spring was a really crucial moment in sort of demonstrating to the world how social media could mobilize folks, and hold governments accountable. This sort of demonstration in Tahrir Square, I was actually there accidentally when this happened, but this demonstration in Tahrir Square was only made possible because of the internet, and one individual activist sort of exposing abuse and prisons of petty criminals, and suddenly you have millions of people demonstrating on Tahrir Square, and ultimately taking down Mubarak. In that, and shortly thereafter, we had the rise of groups like ISIS, like Boko Haram, and others that leveraged the internet to recruit, to mobilize. I mean, like, incredible amounts of people from all over the world to a small pocket in Syria and Iraq. And that was made possible by, social media, by closed social media groups, some face-to-face recruitment, but it again would be unlikely to be possible without the vector of social media. Of course, the annexation of Crimea, which is something we're almost revisiting right now in real time, between Russia and Ukraine. was a demonstration in my mind of Russian malign influence. And then the subsequent rise in populism across Europe, South America, the United States, and social media became a very prevalent tool of politicians and populists and groups that support those groups, or groups that support less populist candidates, but suddenly like a campaign that could existed on paper was suddenly almost not entirely but largely conducted online. And then of course there's Brexit and the US elections, which became important vectors where Russia, Iran, and China began to flex their capabilities, not just in social media, but in this sort of cybersecurity space. There was a number of pro-Brexit social media activities that Russia was conducting, or information operations was conducting in the United Kingdom at the time. They even were involved with the Scottish referendum. I think it was a couple of years before this. And they began to see the fruits of their labor, right? Like, oh, suddenly, like we know that we can use social media to sort of potentially, shape outcomes. And then, COVID, the US elections, I mean, there's so many more, have put us in what I consider the red zone, or in this infodemic space, where it's sort of the perfect storm of, global geopolitical issues meeting, a global health pandemic meeting, elections integrity, folks questioning the very basis of democracies, all sort of coming to a head in this moment. That plus the fact that cyber capabilities can play a huge role in sort of shaping outcomes is sort of put us in a really unprecedented place, I'll say. I've talked a lot about Russia today, mainly because it's, well, for a lot of reasons, they've really solidified the modern playbook that we see, but also front of mind for me because I'm sort of, focusing on that in my current day job. But we often look to Russia as sort of the purveyors of sort of the modern playbook on how to conduct information operations and disinformation campaigns. So, Russia really began in earnest and sort of interfering in and promoting pro-candidates in former Soviet states for quite a while, but especially in Western democracies since 2014. And sort of but yet their broader influence operations sort of date back to sort of the Cold War. Information operations were used to subvert Western alliances, to undermine the West and sort of strengthen the East. There were several U.S. examples of this. There was the launch of a Reagan means war campaign, where Russia felt that Reagan would be really bad for Russia. So they used traditional, obviously sans social media, traditional media and influence campaigns to denigrate Ronald Reagan. There was a catalyst moment where there was a forged document that was released, a fake document that was released by Russian agents that sort of also denigrated Jimmy Carter and saying that he intentionally was subverting global alliances. And so this got the attention of the CIA and other members of the U.S. government to realize that they had to take these issues really seriously. And so where Russia has sort of landed on this is, in the early 2000s, late 1900s, influence was a really tough thing, and it was tough in that it took a lot of time, right? You couldn't do it quickly, and so they determined that interference and overturning elections might be more difficult than just generally undermining trust in institutions and democracies. So there was a pretty strategic shift from, trying to for instance, denigrate at that time Reagan and Carter to sort of just doing something called active measures. And let me see here. I thought I had another slide on this. I thought I had it. I think I have it later on. Just quickly, I'm going to go through this and then we'll probably close up here in like the next few minutes, hopefully. I have another case study here that I like to talk about because I think it really illuminates sort of the Russian playbook and how it's developed over time. There is this incident, hoping you can guess which one I'm referring to here, where the early details of this sort of pandemic, as we say, are that there was a small cluster of cases that caught the attention of CDC of this particular virus in the United States. Those that were particularly impacted were folks with compromised immune systems. Next, we see the CDC sounding the alarm and saying that, listen, this is a huge problem. They went to the White House and said they needed more funding and resources to combat this likely pandemic. And they got little support from the White House. 70 million people became infected globally. International travel was a vector for spreading the virus. There were early conspiracy theories here that said that the virus was created in a U.S. lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, to kill U.S. minority populations. And then there was this report called the Siegel Report that sort of claimed that the virus was synthetic and not a natural, or not a virus, in sort of the purer sense of the word. And this report received coverage in 80 countries. It was cited in 200 reports and published in 30 languages and shared on the U.S. nightly news. This was all the early part of the pandemic. Now we see that 30% of Americans age 50 or older believe that the virus was a conspiracy, is a conspiracy. Does anybody know what I'm referring to here when I mention this? It might be pretty obvious.
The virus itself, you mean the pandemic?
Yeah, like which pandemic or virus am I referring to here, I guess is the question.
Shape of the pandemic that we're in right now. I mean, I don't know. I haven't heard any.
Yeah, actually, this is the AIDS HIV virus that
in the 1980s.
In the 1980s, yes. So I sort of use this example to demonstrate that Russia's playbook has been active for quite some time, and it's been strategic for quite some time. And the Siegel Report was planted. It was written by a German in East Germany. They had media buys all over the world to spread this idea that the virus was created in a U.S. lab. And the intent was really to subvert alliances, to undermine the U.S., to create global skepticism in the U.S. And global skepticism of the U.S., especially in emerging democracies. Ultimately, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so the question then that comes up is, to what extent what we're experiencing today, some 30 some years later with a pandemic, and you're saying, well, okay, that's the thing that's filtering in, and even it becomes sort of like mainframe argument, because you could have state officials, taking all this information and really like moving it around, and at best it's misinformation because everybody has the sense that they want to be the first one to report something.
Exactly.
It becomes an issue of just the confusion of policy, and we even living through the process right now, in some ways. So it's very difficult to decipher, right?
And the difference between now and then is that, obviously the presence of social media and, this campaign, I think, Russia had spent over 10 years, I want to say, on, and it was officially called Operation Infection. And it was part of sort of the KGB. It was an operation sort of sanctioned by the KGB. In fact, Vladimir Putin in his early days as a KGB agent was very intricately involved in this. But it just shows that today the scale of a campaign like this or an effort like this can take months instead of decades or years. And so
it's a lot more pervasive. It's a lot more like, a lot more immediate. The
Exactly.
information that we all get constantly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you have like the anti-vaccination or any of those movements, or movements again in quotations. I mean, I really have a hard time with that being a movement, but um, so it becomes even scarier what you're presenting right now.
Exactly. And I'll just sort of switch forward to well, let me see if I got this image on the right is actually one of that was being, promoted in traditional media by Russia. This is like sort of the olden day example of like a social media meme, if you will. But these were sort of spread across traditional media sites, sort of by Russia. But the like one thing here that's just important to note and sort of is sort of something to overlay in our current moment is, even today today, 15 years ago in 2005, one of the key narratives was that the US created this virus to sort of undermine or target minority populations in the United
Yeah.
States. And today, even, 50% of African Americans believe that AIDS is a man-made virus. And so, I mean, we're talking like 25 years later. And so if you think about where we might be with COVID, 25 years from now, especially with social media, it's likely to be much worse than that.
Yeah,
And
and
yeah.
some of it is built on things that have happened. Some of it is built on history. I mean, I'm fascinated. You also like, in your bio, it says, you're also like a non-resident fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, right? So democracy relies on information. So information becomes sort of like, the cure and the poison at the same time, right? So because it's like this massive amounts of information really becomes really problematic.
And it's really, something I think about a lot. And even I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's sort of the blessing and the curse of democracy and free speech and, free press. It is that there is, not only do we have the freedom to hear, just to read and say what we want, we also have the, that also encapsulates the freedom to hear what we want, right? So unfiltered. And so, in countries that have a really strong hand and where the state controls the media, I mean, there's top down, disinformation, right? And misinformation and the intent to manipulate. But in democracies where, of course, like we hold on to the freedom of speech and freedom of press, it sort of creates the perfect vector for manipulation for states that want to manipulate outcomes. And then, of course, it's not just state actors. At some point, there's unwitting and even witting citizens of their own country that are sharing false information. So we're just in a moment where we're seeing the combination of that with COVID.
Yeah, I mean it's a brand new kind of like field that we're in. And especially, in the part of the world that we are looking at, even with the seminar, just like you mentioned Russia and Ukraine, but I mean, I can think of like every country in the region that it becomes sort of like a cheap tool or a cheap weapon that you can utilize, right? I mean, it's weaponized. The information is weaponized that way.
Absolutely, and I and these issues, I'm talking from a very like US perspective because I'm looking at this
like we want you to,
but there is there is no shortage of issues in the Eastern Med, and I'd love to hear more from the group about based off of this presentation sort of what sort of upcoming or ongoing policy issues present an opportunity for malign influence or information operations or the manipulation of information, not only from a foreign state actor but sometimes from within, right? It could be a legislator, an appropriator, it could be a political party, it could be I mean, I would just be curious to hear from the group like sort of what you are seeing in your own environments as potential vectors for these sorts of activities. And so, I mean, I'm happy to do that now. Actually,
I mean, I just wanted to interject because you can't see the chat too. But I mean, there was an issue on that in the
Okay.
Immigration, I mean, is an issue that has come up in our discussions here, or like the presentation. So immigration has been weaponized. To what extent, like countries are using like immigrants or
Mm-hmm.
migrants or refugees or asylum seekers as, and even the terminology of the invasion, right? That
Right.
terminology that comes in. So that's one of those issues, especially prevalent in the Eastern Mediterranean as
Mm-hmm.
it is a pathway of immigration. So,
Mm-hmm.
and we see
It's
it
a,
here in the United States too.
absolutely. And I mean, we refer to those often as wedge issues. So, it, you have immigration, you have, different political parties having different views on immigration. Um, uh, on the one side, you have, nationalists like, believing that there's a certain process or there's a certain expectation for what, or if immigration should, exist in the way that it does. And then there's, ideas for a pervasive, and open, and welcoming approach to immigration. It drives political discourse, and it becomes a really easy target for an adversary to create, the intent of all these actors are very different. China is very economically focused. They're very, focused on uh, uh, exporting. They're most concerned with economics, right? So a lot of the things that they do is through the lens of economic enhancement, and sort of becoming the chief power of sort of the global economy. Russia is very interested in a shift from west to east. They would love to create a situation in which countries, for instance, in the Eastern Mediterranean, are not wanting to join, I mean, NATO. They're not wanting to join global institutions. They want to leave Brexit. They want to accept Russian exports to the point where, there is this slow shift east, and it creates a scenario for Russia where it puts them in a great position of power. Iran, on the other hand, is very much concerned with regional, regional prominence, in the face of, Saudi and others. They see fragile democracies in the Middle East as like the prime stomping ground for them to sort of exert their influence, whether it be by, creating trade channels for, in Iraq, so that Iraq is reliant on Iranian exports, and or so that they have, Iranian influence in, political parties, which we see very much so in Iraq, in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. It's Iran, Iran's goals, while they are, global, and that we often see them as wanting, well, for a long time, wanting the U.S. to reaffirm the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the agreement that the U.S., the UN, and a few other countries joined in to sort of accept a certain level of uranium enrichment in Iran, but with the oversight of these like Western governments, and very much so that for a very long time they, in the West, particularly in the United States and Western Europe, they're looking for politicians and parties that are in favor of a soft Iranian policy. So there's a lot of different intent here, but I think, in terms of the Eastern, Matt, again, I'm not completely familiar with the geopolitical dynamics of the region, but I would look at events there through the chapeau of China as wanting, economic dependent, or wanting countries to economically depend on them, Russia wanting a pivot east, and Iran looking for policies that are in favor of a softer policy on Iran.
Yeah, it's that constant vulnerability, and it's the constant kind of a thing what you can weaponize to create a rift on the other side. It's just the ease by which you can do it, and the plethora of information that comes through that it's very difficult to decipher. So even like,
Absolutely.
even if we're looking at what we have experienced as far as even dealing with the pandemic in the last 22 months per se, right? Some of the misinformation or even disinformation that we have experienced is also very problematic. And it has to do with the fact that, you can turn on the TV or you can turn on the radio, or you can turn on your phone and you can get information from a number of experts. And then it creates a great deal of just this um, problem and it could be not it could be misinformation. I don't even want to go to the issue of disinformation, but it creates enough of a lack of a trust in a mass society that it's problematic in a consolidated democracy like the United States.
Hmm.
When we're talking about societies that are not necessarily consolidated democracies like
Hmm.
in the Eastern Mediterranean, at best you are talking about an Arab Spring or an Arab awakening. At worst, you're talking about a manipulation that creates complete governmentless black holes.
Hmm.
So it becomes a major security component that we don't necessarily calculate in the way that we had in the past.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the things that I'm thinking about is what has happened in the last couple of weeks, and we had a couple of panelists talk about this, is the East Med pipeline.
Hmm.
um, this was just an intent by three governments to see a feasibility plan, that they sign an agreement for a feasibility study. And everybody used it as a fait accompli that an East Med pipeline was going to be done. All of a sudden, this U.S. non-paper is leaked, and which says that the U.S. never supported this. Now, non-paper, which was leaked,
Hmm.
that it says this. So it has created this sort of like, massive hysteria from all this massive amounts of analysts who are all of a sudden, analyzing intention, intent, American interest, American positioning, so on and so forth. So in
Hmm.
that way, I think it's pervasive in so many different ways and so dangerous.
Absolutely. And, it's not as much as, I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific case, but
Yeah.
I'd imagine that the person that leaked the document knew about the impact, had the intent of, undermining this agreement. And it's very easy to see how like a hacking and leaking effort like that has just time and time again produced outcomes in favor of the criminal or the adversary, and undermining alliances or trade unions or policy agreements. It doesn't take much to do that anymore. We saw previously that like part of the Russian playbook was leaking or planting a document about Jimmy Carter in the 1980s. That was 42 years ago. And, folks have learned, adversaries, and this is actually a good point on this slide, they learn from each other here. So, for COVID, you can see here there's a bunch of proxy websites that are Russia, Iran, and China used that looked like they were, their English language. They looked like they were Western sources of information, all pinpointing COVID on the United States as a virus created yet again in Fort Detrick, Maryland. This is fast forward almost 45 years, and China learned from Russia, that okay, like, well, this narrative has already been out there. It was used 45 years ago. People still believe it. Let's just not like do the dirty work of having to create a new narrative. Let's hang on to something that's already had an impact. And Russia, Iran, and China all, well, Russia has had used this in the past, but Iran and China latched on to this pretty quickly. And smartly, in my opinion. And suddenly you have, 3 in 10 Americans believing that COVID was created in a lab. And you also now have the interference of, far or conspiracy theory groups like QAnon saying the same thing. So it's that tactic, that was used in the Med, in leaking the document. I mean, the way that our adversaries refine their approach is by learning from the successes and failures of others. And so it's an interesting point that you make here, because the playbook is as that was started in Russia has become a very helpful one for anybody looking to get involved in the information manipulation space.
Yeah, and then like just to continue on this, I think I mean, then how do you counter this? How do you defend against this, right? So because if you can defend it, and we saw it even what happened with the previous president and what Twitter does and shuts down. So you take an approach that's sort of like anti-democratic and saying, what, that kind of a speech is it's harmful speech. I'm not going to allow it, and then it becomes sort of like a subjective kind of a thing that you're doing. How do you, or authoritarian states have no problem with that at all, like completely shutting it down. How do you create the necessary critical thinking that, you talk about QAnon, but some stories make their way to the New York Times or the Washington Post, right? So,
and that's really the gold standard. If a foreign adversary can plant disinformation and it gets amplified to the point where it's captured in mainstream media in any given country, you've just struck gold, because you went from reaching maybe a couple 100,000 people online to now reaching millions. And again, going back to Operation Infection, the report that was planted by Russia back in the 1980s made it to U.S. nightly news. Like it was, and once you get it in mainstream media, you are not going to turn off that spigot, and so and it's going to be really tough to diminish the credibility of something that's being shared on something like the New York Times, when it is to a lot of people a credible and and trusted source of news. So there's a couple of things that at the very core of the problem here, especially when it comes to information operations, is to having a fractured democracy. And I don't think anybody has a single answer to how to fix that, except for like the fundamentals of adhering to the fundamentals of what we think about when we think about democracy, which is representation. It's free and fair elections, right? I won't go down that rabbit hole at this current moment, but in terms of you can even have free and fair elections, and they can be made to believe that they weren't free and fair by 40% of like a population, for instance. Economic equality, justice, all of these things, like the less that those appear in a democratic construct, the easier it is for an adversary to meddle. The other thing is world leaders need to understand the impact of their platform. I mean, I'm talking about world leaders on the global stage. I'm talking about like politicians at the local level. One of the things, aside from everything I mentioned, that's really accelerated the belief in false narratives is the fact that we heard them repeated by credible voices at the highest echelons of power globally. And so there needs to be, there needs to be an understanding of like what that words matter here. And social media, the platform, at the State Department or the Department of Justice or the Foreign Office or the Bundestag, like those need to be respected platforms for communications. Beyond those things, there's a bunch of things that we often talk about. We need to spend time not just countering the problem, but really thinking about, as a global community, what we need to do to build citizen capacity to combat this. Media literacy is huge. I mean, it needs to be taught in the classroom from a very young age. Critical thinking skills need to be taught in the classroom from a very young age. Those are two things that are ongoing in sort of like our the United Nations focuses on that, the EU member states, but it needs to be taken to scale. Social media companies, I mean, it's tough to not see their role in this. And I think now you see, Facebook, running advertisements saying that they want regulation, but they need somebody to tell them what that looks like. I'm a free speech person to my core. But if you're going to host a platform where anybody can say anything and it leads to harm, it leads to, people taking Invermectin, or let's say drinking, or like taking some sort of an ad hoc fix to COVID and it kills them, like the platform needs to be held accountable. I mean, there's an accountability measure that social media platforms must be, held accountable for. So social media regulation, critical thinking skills, media literacy, transparency and accountability and democracy. I mean, the list goes on. I think there needs to be more fact-checking organizations that are nonpartisan, that are focused on the facts and not political discourse. And I think, honestly, the media needs to be educated as well about the power of their words, and the power of the posture that they can take to sort of increase and incite, further divisions, because we've gotten into such a fractured and polarized place. The media, plays a huge role in that now. And in parts of the world, and like Germany and the UK, there's still a significant amount of trust in media. You have like the historic BBC, that it's very present. It's on national news in the evening. It's there's a trust for institutions like that. I know we have National Public Radio, and we have oh my gosh, the U.S. Association for Global Media, which used to be the BBG, I want to say, but it's not, we don't put money into we don't put as much money into independent media as we should globally. So those are a couple of things. I'm happy to send more ideas after this session here today, because I have plenty.
Yeah, you and I could be talking forever. I'll let you finish, and then we can maybe, if there are questions out there.
Yeah, I mean, I know these are just some of the intent here for information operations, and we've talked about all of these. None of these are probably a surprise to you. And I just, as we look forward, I think, I'm thinking about a couple of things. The continued confluence of cybersecurity and information operations. We have, there's several elections coming up that I would recommend, us as a community keep an eye on and see like how adversaries try to interfere. Of course, there's the French elections in 2022. We have Colombian elections coming up. South America is increasingly has been for a long time, but increasingly so been a playground for foreign adversaries to meddle, Colombia and Brazil, namely. And then Ukraine and Russia, which is really something that we're on the precipice of in this current moment. And what Russian aggression, I encourage everybody here to follow along with Russia and Ukraine. And, by way of background, Ukraine, it has the support of the West to sort of make an open application, to NATO, and Russia doesn't want that, because again, that'll shift them, west, vice east, and Russia has indicated, that they'll take, by and large, whatever action necessary to prevent that from happening. And so this is playing out in real time right now. And I imagine there's going to be a number of cyber things, information operations that happen in relation to this in the coming week, I'd say. So that's just it. I would love to sort of take questions here and sort of hear from the group. I know I've been speaking for a long time, so apologies.
No. I think it's fine, and thank you. I mean, it's fine, and we just open it up more of as a discussion. Like I said, the immigration issue was one of those issues that came through, and that we have discussed here. But even the issues of like this the and non-paper that came in out of the U.S. is a major issue, and even like the issue of Ukraine, I think is a fascinating issue. And like if I'm monitoring to see if somebody's brave enough to raise their hand, and then in the 10 minutes that we have. But I'm just fascinated with it because before we started, I had read the headline in the New York Times. We're talking about saboteurs possibly coming into Ukraine from Russia, and those are the kinds of stories that I look at it myself and say, okay, well, how much truth is into that story? You lure somebody to make some kind of a knee-jerk reaction kind of a thing, because it's not only these are not monolithic actors, so if I'm sure the administration feels a lot of pressure even internally. So what are you going to do, Mr. Biden? Are you going to let the Russians push you around? Is this like something that, are you protecting your son? Are you protecting like your own interest? There's all kinds of stuff that has already been built there. And people have, different places where they get, like the point that you make about the media. I don't know. I think that train has left the station pretty much, because we all like have such siloed pieces of where we get our information, and it's very difficult to break down those silos now. If I'm getting my information from the site that appeals to me, to my thinking, it's very difficult for me to cross over and go somewhere else to get this. So how much of that is just almost like to lure people to have a reaction too?
Yeah, at the end of the day, media institutions are looking for numbers. They're looking for relevance,
Yes.
traffic to their website or to their, channels increases their profit. And so, at the end of the day, there is that, but then there is, I've seen, especially in Eastern Europe and in even during my time in the UK, there are forums that exist where folks can talk to, like, I'm just going to sort of talk around this, but there's venues in which you can educate the media about sort of the reality of the current moment and help them to think about things in a way that they might not be currently thinking about it. So I'll give you an example. In the UK, after and in Europe, when there was just a tremendous amount of attacks, lone wolf attacks, as they say, by ISIS. Studies that have been conducted by like King's College in the UK and others showed that the way that the media was reporting on these attacks was glorifying the attacker, potentially incentivizing others to do something similar. So there was an effort by some folks in the UK and other countries to educate the media about not using the term lone wolf, not giving airtime to the image, the likeness, or the story about the attacker, promoting the story of the victim over the attacker, and a whole slew of other things. And over time, I don't have like the facts and figures to sort of like quantify the results here, but there was a concerted effort by journalists and media organizations and associations to try to flip the script so that it wasn't lone wolf, it was terrorist. It was, it wasn't like to stop glorifying, if you will, like the person that committed the attack, as opposed to like the result and the impact on the victim. So there are, I think in the US we're in a sort of different, our media landscape is, you might be right about the ship has left the dock, right? But globally, I don't know that that's always the case.
Well, Lauren, I couldn't thank you enough. This is, as always, a very thought-provoking discussion with you. And, just even from the comments, this is really an eye-opener for a lot of people. There's a late question that has come in. Let's see. I'm really anxious about the successful integration of the immigrants, refugees hosted in Greece and their integration in the Greek society, especially the role of the media in this. So this is from somebody who is on an island, the island of Samos, off the coast.
Yeah, in those, there's so much that can be said, and I think that's immigration and the impact on well, a couple of things. It sounds like immigration is a really prevalent topic in the discussion about the Eastern Med. And I would venture to guess that maybe not in the island of Samos, but in Greece, it would present a really great opportunity for misinformation, disinformation, for sensational information, for foreign adversaries to meddle should there be an election or a vote of some sort, a referendum of some sort. It sounds like that information needs to be explored. And I don't know to what extent there are academics and writers on this call, but it sounds like that would be a really interesting thing to dive into, whether in this, forum or, next year, Petros, or in, a separate sort of writing or paper. I imagine that will be an important vector for influence and impact in the coming year or years. That's an issue all across Europe, right? I mean, it's Austria, it's with Syrian refugees, it's the Med with North African refugees and immigrants. So I'd be really curious to see more analysis on that topic.
Yeah, so the same person, he's part of that conversation, and it's like, so it's who's fueling what, and you're fueling all kinds of demonstrations, or you have evidence of so, and then you have a very nationalized audience. There's an overwhelming globalization and fear and pandemic and economic crisis and everything else, and you have a demographic decline. So like we saw just this week at the time of this seminar taking place, the census from Bulgaria came out, and Bulgaria lost 11% of its population in the last decade. Bulgaria, who at the time of the 1970s had a similar population to Greece and maybe about 10 million, today has 6.5 million people. And you have a bulging population that's coming in from the east and the south that is not necessarily Christian, that is not necessarily white, and it's not necessarily, this frontier mentality that you'd have even in the United States that's being challenged. But you have a very sedentary, nationalized populace, an identity that's based on religion and nationalism. And that is, that's fertile ground for all kinds of definitely, I wouldn't say misinformation, I would say disinformation there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to the recent point on migrants, refugees activated by fake news on social media, it goes to both sides of the coin. A really smart, if the intent is to stop immigration, or to allow immigration, like of a campaign or an operation of some sort, whomever is doing that is going to target one side of the coin or both to create domestic unrest, if that's the intent, one side to push along a particular policy issue, either an anti-immigration or pro-immigration platform. And no segment of the population is not off limits for this sort of thing. I can imagine that for immigrant or refugee communities, the messaging they're probably getting is, you're not welcome, your religion and your ethnicity is not respected here. If you're going to be a part of this community, you need to fight for it. Like that is a sort of rhetoric I could see, because we see that everywhere. We see that in all parts of the world, really. So it'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on. And then the role of initiatives that can be taken by national authorities to avoid incidents like riots and protests based off of fake news. Yeah. There's a lot there. That's a really big answer. I mean, the thing about fake news or information is the first person to reach anybody has control of the narrative. So if your national government or local government is several steps behind, the truth, and getting the truth out there, they've lost control of the narrative or the outcome. So when I speak with folks that are learning how to how to get ahead of a potential protest related to disinformation or what have you. It's about being ready to respond. It's about spending time, and this isn't something that most small governments are equipped with, spending time like observing what's happening in the social media environment, knowing what folks are saying. It's being like having a planned response. It's being the first to share factual information, whether through social media or a press briefing or a media interview. So it's first movers advantage 95% of the time when it comes to this fight. And so, we try to encourage folks to be prepared for, know what the issues are, know what folks are saying, know what platforms your constituents or your audiences are getting information from. Have your talking points or your response ready. I mean, there's so many things that I could say on this matter, but it's about being prepared ultimately if you're going to get ahead of this fight.
Well, as I said before we started, that this is going to be fascinating. Absolutely, it has been great, and you leave us with wanting more, which is great. As always, thank you I know your time is very valuable. I know you're doing two things at the same time right now, and I do appreciate it. I think we all appreciate it. Thank you very much. Before we close out, I do want to say to everybody, tomorrow we are at 9 a.m. Boston time, 1600 Athens time, and we're going to have Dr. Tsarouchas give us the closing keynote, and we have a roundtable discussion at noon Boston time, which is 7 p.m. Athens time tomorrow. So hopefully today was another enjoyable day for everyone. Again, thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much.
May I add the comment, please?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the hospitality. Mrs. Protendis, I really liked your presentation. Thank you for that. It was really insightful. Continuing my comments, I'm really anxious about the power of social media in Greece in general, not only for the general social life, but concerning the migrants and refugees hosted in Greece. As the Europol local coordinator in Samos hotspot, I have seen people hosted, migrants and refugees hosted in hotspots across the Aegean Islands, really activated and very sensitive in fake news on social media. So my question is that because the Greek authorities are a bit back in probably the US initiatives taken regarding the monitoring of social media, is what we can do in order to tackle fake news on social media regarding specific issues about these people. You understand that these people are very sensitive in fake news regarding their future. So probably I will contact you in person in order to establish better contact regarding this issue. And I really thank you about your presentation, because you give me a lot of ideas. You gave me a lot of ideas. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, feel free to reach out to this email down here, and I'd be happy to share the resources that I have at my disposal to help you out.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you, Lauren, again.
Thank you. Cheers, everybody.
Bye-bye.